fling the microphone to Sam and just have a little bit of a, well, you tell us what you want to do, Sam, but a little bit of a conversation about, well, what did it do? Why does landscape matter? These are big bloody grasshoppers out there that can't even
Yeah, so I think that's the best approach. If we just kind of make it a discussion, if we can. It feels a bit weird, me just kind of talking to you. And I should be really clear that, you know, I'm a UN person from the south coast, New South Wales. I grew up at the base of Gulaga Mountain, and that's my, you know, my home. That's the place that resonates to me, sings to me. So, you know, I'm not Ngarigo, I'm not Wolgaloo, though I have Ngarigo and Wolgaloo friends. You know, UN people would have come up and used this landscape as well, been here for ceremony, for food, for marriage, for all sorts of things. So it feels really amazing to be up here, but it's a little bit spooky too. I mean, it's such a powerful place. You can feel it, you can see it, and I guess, you know, for me, what gets to the heart of why would this landscape be valuable? I mean, there are so many aspects, but fundamentally, it's about creation, right? Like this is the site of creation. It's the site of life giving. The weather's made here, and it's the same, you know, around Australia. We've got these mountains that we connect to, and they tell us where we come from, where we return to, and they're the carers for us, because through orographic rainfall, like that's how we get the water and that's how we live. So, I mean, it's partly about resources, but it's also about the non-physical aspects of country. You know, it's so important. And you can, I mean, certainly when I'm here, I can feel it and sit here, and it feels like a really strong place, but it wouldn't be somewhere I want to be all the time, you know, like, and that's my understanding of these really high parts of country too. It's like you come here for a reason, you come here for ceremony, you come here to pay respect and to care for country because it cares for you, but you're not going to perch up and live here year round, and I think that's why so many of the issues that we're seeing when we talk about Indigenous management of country, you know, it was so disrupted as soon as we came in and brought this sort of Western colonial idea of property and boundaries into a landscape that historically, you know, the only boundaries were biophysical and natural boundaries. You know, if we look at different countries' boundaries, and of course there's a level of fuzziness and overlap and all of that. It's because of connectivity, but generally looking at rivers, you know, water is so important in the landscape, and so it's clear why somewhere like this is so important. And it feels pretty rough looking at the way that it's been managed, and the way that it's been dammed up and driven by an economics that doesn't speak to the history of reciprocity and connection to country. So I guess it'd be really good just to talk with everyone about, you know, now we're 2/3 of the way through the trip, and we've heard a lot of different perspectives from different, you know, land owners, and I think it's been good. Most of them have, you know, recognised Indigenous sovereignty, I guess, to a point, but you know, it's hard to recognise sovereignty when you own 100 acres or 1,000 acres or however much that is. It is hard to do that, but I guess, yeah, maybe we can just have a chat. If you guys have thought anything sort of twigged in your mind as we've been going through this process, not necessarily about the alpine tip of the alpine region, but down into the plateau and you know, all of this country, it's all connected.
So going forward into the course, students will be asked to think arise the question that if we are to live well in the Anthropocene, we need to discover or rediscover a biosensitive way of thinking. Now that's not to appropriate indigenous understandings and worldview, but I think we can potentially look to indigenous biosensitivity and work out for ourselves, think for ourselves, what will it mean for us to live in a biosensitive way in the Anthropocene, in this world that we've created, for better or worse. That's our environment. How will we live well in it, and what does it mean to be biosensitive and to be ecologically literate and socially aware, such that we can live a good life. And in that sense, our struggle is a kindred struggle with that of indigenous people. It's not the same fight, it's not the same issues, it's not the same background, it's not the same culture, but it is directed towards a similar end. So that might be another way of leading that in.
Absolutely. I think, and that's a really interesting question. And fundamentally, I think it's really important to have a discussion about what the Anthropocene is. When does it start? I mean, that's a really big question that Indigenous scholars around the world are having, because we think about the Anthropocene. I think nominally at the moment it's kind of the start of the industrial era, but some people have said, oh, well, it goes back to, if Aboriginal people managed landscapes, then maybe it should go back millennia. Zoe Todd, who's a First Nations scholar from Turtle Island, Canada, she argues that, well, actually, no, it should be the date of contact and settlement and really the start of colonization, because if we were on a track working with and for country for millennia, it's unlikely that we would have got to a point in the last 250 years where we would have dammed up all of these rivers and changed the landscape to that extent. So I think, it's really important to sort of say, where does the Anthropocene begin? Who is responsible for that? But also, of course, we've got shared aspirations. We want to see where most of us are doing ecology, or we're in the Fenner School and we're interested in the landscape for one reason or another, and I think we all want to see it looked after. And what's difficult is the impediments that are currently in place in this Anthropocene for us to do that in a way that brings the value and the knowledge and the culture and the histories of working with this landscape into this new era. I mean, fundamentally, fences are one of the most difficult things to navigate if we want to, revive cultural management of the landscape. And we didn't have fences, so it's really hard to kind of, let's create a patchy mosaic burn and return to traditional burning practices. Well, we can't burn fences because they're really expensive and they're annoying to build, and we've got all this infrastructure in the way. So we do have to kind of we're reviving it, but we're adapting at the same time these principles and protocols. And I think this area is really interesting. We saw yesterday one of the informants said, well, this isn't Ngarigo people's country. Ngarigo people don't exist. It's Monaro people, and they're coming through. And I find that really offensive, knowing Ngarigo people and Wolgali people. Like this is all a connected landscape. So, but I think what's interesting is that's what we've seen here. Definitely this idea that the mountains weren't populated or we weren't here. It really that narrative of erasure plays into the hands of the settler state that wants to keep managing it the way that they always have. And so it's really easy just to say, oh no, Ngarigo people don't exist. It was actually Wiradjuri and they came all the way down. So she was saying it was like, anyway. it's interesting. But I think we've at every turn, and that's what my kind of research is about, is like, can we critique that erasure and actually repopulate the landscape with people? And that's the only way we're going to try to build out some new and adaptive uses of traditional knowledge. I think if we accept that people are here still, you know,
Sorry, you go. No,
Okay.
you go.
I guess I was just going to pick up on that theme of property and the ways that it seems like Indigenous peoples used, especially this landscape, which was kind of a meeting ground, versus the ways that colonisers think of property and access and use of a landscape. Like, that to me is one of the fundamental differences, but it also seems something that would be very, very hard to change, that idea of property at this point. But maybe that is the sort of deeper leverage point that needs to be niggled at.
absolutely. I agree. It's the most difficult thing, you know, the erasure, the dispossession of land, the forced removal of Aboriginal people from country, the forced erasure of culture and knowledge and language, especially in southeastern Australia. You know, we were the first point of that process of colonisation, and so we copped it so hard, so fast, that you can see why people say, "Oh, I've never met an Aboriginal person." It's like, well, you probably have, you know. But there's hope. I think it's happening in really unique ways, you know, at a range of levels. So we're seeing now more and more land, you know, settlers, landholders, entering into agreements of access and use of their land, you know, forming their own mini treaties because they're sick of waiting for the state to do it. We're also seeing in Victoria it's moving in a really positive way. We've also got a lot of Crown land that really represents the bulk of the land that can be returned to Aboriginal management. You know, where I'm from, we've got our mountain was handed back. It's still jointly managed between the Yuin people and and national parks, and that raises a whole lot of issues around priorities and management. But it is happening, and there's always called for treaty. There's been called for treaty for a long time.
A little bit of space for members of the public. We just got but if you could push into that corner and be small and compact, yet still perfectly full.
COVID safe at the same
And COVID safe. And please, I think.
Yeah, I was going to build on what you were saying before, Sam. We were talking about the grazing stakeholders, that they have this resentment that they were taken off the land that they have so much tradition and so much, you know, history with, but like it's just lack of perspective and lack of respect too that's happened to the Indigenous people. And like, you know, they think that the grazers think that, you know, it's not fair. It's so not fair that they got kicked off this land that they were on. And yeah, it's just the lack of perspective and the lack of respect.
Yeah, and lack of education, right? Like, that's one of the hardest things to grapple with. Like, in the course that I teach into, a few of them, you know, it's a second and third year course, so students have been in university for 2 or 3 years, and they come in, and it's the same. It's a process of unlearning and engaging with a history that they haven't had access to. I mean, I went to high school, primary school. There was none of this was in the curriculum, and we're slowly seeing a change. You know, Uncle Bruce Pascoe's books has been turned into a Year 10 geography curriculum in New South Wales now. So I expect to see the next generation of students coming through with the baseline knowledge that's going to mean that we can have more difficult and nuanced conversations about all of this and actually come to a space where we can start to find those leverage points, like you were saying.
And it's like that baseline, like being able to go into an area without that sort of baseline kind of like wilderness misconception, being like, this is a wild place with no people in it, you know, like that is an idea that, I mean, at least when I was at school, like that's how it kind of got taught, you know, like wilderness is wild and people are unnatural and they go into it without, you know, without this whole history of people in Australia, and that is natural in Australia, like that's how the system functions in Australia. You know, that baseline and kind of on that kind of biosensitivity thing, I feel like that is a trend now that's increasing, and places like this facilitate that connection to nature in a way that, you know, you can't be sensitive to these problems if you don't spend time in it. It's really hard to care if you don't come out here, and that's why this sort of thing is so important. I think like parks and, you know, managing it correctly is obviously difficult, but that's why they kind of need to exist, because people need to form those connections. Otherwise, you know, like how can you treat it well?
Absolutely. And that comes into policy, like we were discussing at Chimney Ridge. If someone in Sydney is making a decision about how a place like this needs to be managed, but they haven't spent the time here, it's really hard. And that's, I mean, these are the structural issues, I think, that make it really hard to get to where we want to be. I think collectively,
I think it's like, I mean, the same thing maybe with like a lot of Indigenous issues. If people who were engaging with these issues on like a policy front or whatever, if they just spent more time with Indigenous people, they'd have like their perspective would just be much more grounded in in the real world. The same thing with this sort of thing. If people who are making these policies, you know, you just need to at least be here. I mean, conceptually at least, you know, and ideally physically.
Unfortunately, I think the environment and caring for country is not really a solid political platform, right? Like, you quite quickly get relegated as a green or, you know.
But I think that's becoming less and less. I mean, at least with like young people I know, like that's becoming less and less of a negative thing. Like I can't think of anyone that I'm friends with that thinks of Greens as a negative thing. Like a lot of them are just like.
To like though. You know, I don't generally hang out with people who...
Young people are kind of more, I don't know, maybe that's just what every young person said through history, and then they go and then they get a job and then they become a liberal.
I on what Bridget was saying with the mythology surrounding the cattle grazing, and just thinking about the connection between that and, say, decommissioning the dams and things, is that over time, you know, these things were constructed or built up, and you kind of get to a point of no return. And if you try and take it away, you know, like decommission the dams or take the cattle off, there's going to be pushback. You can't return the landscape to how it once was, and that's kind of what really confounds me. Is how you kind of move past that and or move forward and try and maintain a kind of balance or contentment in the landscape or between people, because ultimately we want to, like, I don't know, bring people together in this. I think this is still a kind of like I'm still kind of digesting this, but like you can't just take it away and you're gonna have like a collapse, whether it's culturally or environmentally. It's that wicked problem, I guess. But yeah, it's amazing being in this landscape, and kind of it's so peaceful right now, but all around us there's all of these really silent pressures and constraints and things, so something to think about in your assignments.
Nothing like barreling down the end. That's great. I think one of the common questions that stems from this discussion and then spreads its wings across all students, wherever their backgrounds is, that needs to be surfaced is narratives of progress. what stories of progress do we believe? We've been told that this is a journey of betterment from a time when life was nasty, brutish and short, typically gesturing to a sort of a hunter-gatherer, pre-civilized worldview where you squabbled and fought, last man standing got the chop, through to a time where you lived in your sort of Anglo-Saxon hovels and it rained all the time, which it did, through to this glory of the modern economic times that we live in, where we're all happy as Larry and we get up at 5 in the morning to drive 2 hours to work, to earn the keep, to pay for the little house that we have out somewhere in the Sydney suburbs, to watch telly and be crashed out and asleep by 8 o'clock at night, as a pinnacle of achievement for humankind.
Absolutely.
So
as long as you've got land, right?
So I just think these stories need to be thought about, and of course a common one, as an English person with an English background, is that the English common folk ran out of trees because they burnt them all. And that's what started the Industrial Revolution. Well, in fact, that's simply not true. It started a forested landscape. I think it was the same as it was at the end of the Roman period. And it was the building of things like airfields for World War II that carved into woodland. So we need to ask these stories that we're told, because that's why we swallow roles where most people don't come into a landscape like this. Because they're too busy working for the man.
Progress. Yeah, that's
Chasing
right.
progress.
I mean, I love that argument that life was just terrible and hard for Aboriginal people. Like, if you get a chance to look at Bill Gammage's greatest estate on earth, it's amazing because he's not doing anything except going through the journals of the first explorers, settlers, through the landscape. They're explaining what they're seeing, and that this whole narrative around like the lazy Aboriginal person just sitting around like painting all day, and it's like, and if we, that's right, if we, and then that butts up against this sort of Lockean idea of, well, you need to mix the sweat of your brow while you're toiling the earth. That's the only way that you can like earn the respect of the land. But if you look at what we were doing, I think over millennia, you get your systems and processes to a point where it sort of takes care of itself, and then actually it's more like the aristocracy where you're sitting around and you're learning how to play the piano, or you're painting all day, or you're spending time with friends, and we were singing, dancing, doing ceremony and building this really meaningful life because we got management down so well that we would drive food to us. We didn't have to run around and chase it. We didn't have to manage these massive herds of giant animals because we work with what's here in a way that, it's about reciprocity. It's about making sure that we respect the country so that and then life can be easy. It's really hard to think about returning to that now, because we do have this modern life.
Maybe hints of what the regenerative agriculture from Charlie Massey and Joe and Ted were alluding to. Not that they seem to carve themselves out a particularly indolent lifestyle, but the principles of asking what's nature, if you like, trying to do, and how can I work with that, enhance and channel it, but not constantly try to push against it to some different end. Maybe there's some hints of a biosensitive way of farming in those underlying principles, and then yes, I get this all working, it will start to look after itself. And you heard Charlie saying that.
Yeah, and it's a cultural thing too, We've got a kangaroo problem, right? In Canberra, everywhere it's rampant and we're not managing it.
It's an economic issue.
That's right, and yet we're farming these cattle that are foreign animal that destroy the landscape. It's not a big step from cow to kangaroo, but I think culturally for some people it is. But there are solutions to some of these problems. I just think for some people they're not palatable, or they're too outside of their paradigm.
Anyone else? Any other? So the camera moves off me onto.
It's very nice.
So that's the mighty Snowy River. There was plans to have a dam up here. There was going to be. We'll edit that out from the sound tape. I don't know exactly where it was intended to be, but there was plans for a Kosciuszko dam. But again, that was when the scheme was designed to have dozens and dozens and dozens of these sort of smaller power stations running all the way through it. But that's not how they ended up building it, and that's good, because this landscape sits entirely above at least the Snowy hydro scheme, and so to that extent is unaffected by it, and mildly indicative of what it might have been like going back through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because we haven't lost a fire regime here, it is relatively intact, I think, which is awesome. I mean, the grazing pressures aside, but it seems to have returned pretty well.
Yeah, the shrub and heath layer is certainly up now that it's had the pressure of grazing removed. It's amazing, sort of 60, 70 years on, and it is, I wouldn't say at its apex, but it's where it can now regenerate wholly all by itself into the future, unless climate change pressures change it up a whole lot, which we are seeing a reduction in snowpack, warmer summertime temperatures, reduction in spring and autumn rainfalls, so those pressures are indeed great.
This magma decline is sad as well. That's a really important part of the landscape. I think I will mention that I've never spoken to an Aboriginal person who's been pro-Brumby feral horse, and especially in sensitive landscapes like this. So if you're thinking about an argument in your papers, put me on the other side of the Brumby lovers.
And of course, many Indigenous people were valued for their stock riding skills, their contributions to running animals through this landscape, the knowledge of the landscape, and were excellent riders and the like. So it doesn't have to go hand in glove with work with horses to then undying love affair.
And I'm sure this is across Australia, but the Indigenous people were the first guides. They showed the Europeans around. They showed them where to go and how to live up here, and we really threw it back in their faces, particularly up in the Jindabyne area. It was very brutal. There was water holes poisoned, and I guess smallpox had kind of decimated the population anyway. But yeah, it was.
I know there's a paddock, I think quite a large paddock in Jindabyne that's got like skeletal remains and Aboriginal artifacts scattered through it, but there's potential development there, and I know that a lot of them have tried to fight it, but it's just a continuation of that dispossession and kind of paving over of history.
I think the Jindabyne area up here in the Kosciuszko National Park has a real lack of Indigenous representation. It's very hard to promote it, and there are so few Ngarigo peoples left on country up here.
Well, that's right. I mean, we've got, as I was saying, we've got Ngarigo people in Tilba, like where I grew up, and so that's how I know them. But it's because there's not a lot of space left here, I think, and we were talking about this last night. Why don't we have more rangers, Aboriginal rangers, or why don't we have more people up here? And I think it's now down to to burnout, really. I've seen so much of it where you try to fight for something for so long, but you're fighting against these structures and bureaucratic systems that you can't get a foothold in, and then you burn out and you say, well, I'm done. And I've seen that on the coast with, I read something terrible, that there was only a small handful of Aboriginal rangers in New South Wales left because they've been burned out, or they've been put in positions where they're being forced to kind of police against their own community. So we used to have 3 rangers back home, and none of them work for parks anymore because they don't want to do it. So it's hard, how do we do it? And I think we've got to create space, and maybe an option would be a hand back of this area, or entering into a joint management system. But that brings up so many issues as well with priorities. And as you were saying, once you enter into that kind of framework, your sovereignty is diluted to that of a stakeholder, where you get a say. And some people would argue, well, a say is better than no say at all. But I know there's some committees. There's an Aboriginal working group, Snowy Mountain Kosciuszko working group up here, and work towards renaming some of the peaks and mountains and stuff.
Finding that information is incredibly difficult when they were so dispossessed. And I'd love to see Indigenous naming coming on up here. We've managed to get a sign installed, a Welcome to Country sign installed down in the National Parks office in Jindabyne. There are some in the pipeline for sort of entering the resort areas, coming up into the national park. But again, difficult to get it all through paperwork.
We were driving past, looking at the Alpine resorts. It was a bit rough, but
Do you see what I mean about it looking like all train set? Like that
yeah. But I just mean that the BBC is kind of mad about it.
Well, you're kind of looking at me like, hang on, like.
Yeah, I can't imagine many traditional owners being stoked about that, and I think, it'd be really interesting to know if any of the profits of the Alpine resorts are trickling back into community as some sort of recognition of sovereignty, or of paying the rent, which is a term we like to throw around a lot, but it doesn't often equate to
Good question for
a translation. Yeah, that would be, maybe one of you can ask it.
I can't.
She will choke. Sorry.
No, but that's a really good point, right? Like, if we're taking seriously.
Probably off camera.
Who says that?
Perisher won't even put money in to contribute to the sign.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I guess it's Vale, right? They're on a Vale now, so they're well out of
Yeah,
Canada.
Yeah, Vale are a global corporation.
Yeah.
They have a lot of resorts in the US mainly.
Yeah.
US, Canada, Japan.
Yeah.
As all things skiing and relationships with resorts, what we're going to move on to, are you happy to move on from here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So maybe a last thought as you pan camera out across that landscape is, seriously, if the only way of judging what is the appropriate or best thing to do with what you're seeing is its immediate economic return in narrowly dollar value, I think you're going to lead yourself to making some fairly limited choices about what's best for it. And I think that at some level is really what we're talking about in terms of broad range of values that are based on landscapes and decision-making processes, away from that just narrative-fied economic return, which determines so much of what we're doing. And we will talk about that in the course, at least in a limited fashion, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and goals around ecological services, including cultural services, of one form and another. Those again are principles that we can extend to French farming landscapes, and extend them to English Saxon hills, and we can extend them out to traditional landscapes in America and so on and so forth, about what cultural values do we draw out of them, whatever our cultural backgrounds and roots and origins are. And do we just want to give that over to, well, would it be cheaper to have $100 5-story hotel, 5-star hotel on its site? And those are not some decisions we want to make in a French context. Why would we want to make them in?
It's really good to ask those questions, but again, I think it's a really anthropogenic approach to trying to value a landscape. It's like, well, what value do we derive from it? And sometimes it's important to think about the intrinsic value of the landscape and the agency of the landscape, especially if we expand our sort of time scale a little bit from the last 2000, even if we're looking at millennia and then we look at eons, it's this landscape has done so much, and I think it's offensive to just move in and be like, well, it's not serving us anymore, so we're just going to take what we need from it and then kick it down the road a little bit.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to like what you're kind of sensitive to, like in terms of time as well. If you're sensitive to instantaneous kind of things and instantaneous gratification, say it's economic, or how quickly, like if you're talking about costs, I think a lot of the time this thing happens where in the long term something will be cheaper if you do it right, and because it's more sustainable, but in the short term you can do it, for this kind of like the face value cost is less shocking, but the long term it's going to be more expensive and you're not going to be able to get as much out of it. It's like kind of like sensitivity thing, and you might rock up here and look at it and go, this is great for a quick this, like a dam sale, if you're sensitive to that. But if you're sensitive to other things, a good example is the snow gum dieback is, for the longest time, I guess people weren't sensitive to it on a level that we could notice the problems with it. So it took people who were hypersensitive to the trees, that care about them on a level that is weird, to notice that like there's something kind of going wrong. And other people who weren't sensitive, that didn't care about that, because that was in the 1980s that people started to realise, people who were extremely sensitive, the ecologists at Threadboat were like, there's something wrong here. And then Threadboat was obviously not really interested in looking at it anymore, because they're not sensitive to that. They're sensitive to skiing and to developing that in a recreational way. So yeah, it comes down to, I think, what you kind of focus your energy on.
I'm so glad that we do have weird people who are paying attention to this stuff and doing PhD. I mean, in some ways, that process, a PhD in ecology or looking at a specific tree species, is far more aligned to a traditional way of engaging and relating with the landscape. I mean, from a totemic point of view, you would have a species of tree that is yours to look after. You relate to it and its kin. And you would have a particular area that was really important to you, and you would know every single rock and every single bug in that landscape. And in some senses now you have to do a PhD to gain that level of detail and understanding. So it's great that it's still happening. I think we